If a dog is man's best friend, shouldn't man be God's best friend? Think about it. No, don't think about it. I never figured that one out. We're going to read chapter 4, section 2, the ego and false autonomy from A Course in Miracles. Here we go. It is reasonable to ask how the mind could ever have made the ego. In fact, it is the best question you could ask. There is, however, no point in giving an answer in terms of the past because the past does not matter, and history would not exist if the same errors were not being repeated in the present. Abstract thought applies to knowledge because knowledge is completely impersonal and examples are irrelevant to its understanding. Perception, however, is always specific and therefore quite concrete. Everyone makes an ego or a self for himself, which is subject to enormous variation because of its instability. He also makes an ego for everyone else he perceives, which is equally variable. Their interaction is a process that alters both because they were not made by or with the unalterable. It is important to realize that this alteration can and does occur as readily when the interaction takes place in the mind as when it involves physical proximity. Thinking about another ego is as effective in changing relative perception as is physical interaction. There could be no better example that the ego is only an idea and not a fact. Your own state of mind is a good example of how the ego was made. When you threw knowledge away, it is as if you never had it. This is so apparent that one need only recognize it to see that it does happen. If this occurs in the present, why is it surprising that it occurred in the past? Surprise is a reasonable response to the unfamiliar, though hardly to something that occurs with such persistence. But do not forget that the mind need not work that way, even though it does work that way now. Think of the love of animals for their offspring and the need they feel to protect them. That is because they regard them as part of themselves. No one dismisses something he considers part of himself. You react to your ego much as God does to his creations, with love, protection, and charity. Your reactions to the self you made are not surprising. In fact, they resemble in many ways how you will one day react to your real creations, which are as timeless as you are. The question is not how you respond to the ego, but what you believe you are. Belief is an ego function, and as long as your origin is open to belief, you are regarding it from an ego viewpoint. When teaching is no longer necessary, you will merely know God. Belief that there is another way of perceiving is the loftiest idea of which ego thinking is capable. That is because it contains a hint of recognition that the ego is not the self. Undermining the ego's thought system must be perceived as painful, even though this is anything but true. Babies scream and rage if you take away a knife or scissors, although they may well harm themselves if you do not. In this sense, you are still a baby. You have no sense of real self-preservation and are likely to decide that you need precisely what would hurt you most. Yet whether or not you recognize it now, you have agreed to cooperate in the effort to become both harmless and helpful, attributes that must go together. Your attitudes even toward this are necessarily conflicted because all attitudes are ego-based. This will not last. Be patient a while and remember that the outcome is as certain as God. Only those who have a real and lasting sense of abundance can be truly charitable. This is obvious when you consider what is involved. To the ego, to give anything implies that you will have to do without it. When you associate giving with sacrifice, you give only because you believe that you are somehow getting something better and can therefore do without the thing you give. Quote, giving to get, unquote, is an inescapable law of the ego, which always evaluates itself in relation to other egos. It is therefore continually preoccupied with the belief in scarcity that gave rise to it. Its whole perception of other egos as real is only an attempt to convince itself that it is real. Quote, self-esteem, unquote, in ego terms means nothing more than that the ego has deluded itself into accepting its reality and is therefore temporarily less predatory. This, quote, self-esteem, unquote, is always vulnerable to stress, a term which refers to any perceived threat to the ego's existence. The ego literally lives by comparisons. Equality is beyond its grasp, and charity becomes impossible. The ego never gives out of abundance because it was made as a substitute for it. That is why the concept of, quote, getting, unquote, arose in the ego's thought system. Appetites are, quote, getting, unquote, mechanisms representing the ego's need to confirm itself. This is as true of body appetites as it is of the so-called, quote, higher ego needs, unquote. Body appetites are not physical in origin. The ego regards the body as its home and tries to satisfy itself through the body. But the idea that this is possible is a decision of the mind, which has become completely confused about what is really possible. The ego believes it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it thinks it originated. This is such a fearful state that it can only turn to other egos and try to unite with them in a feeble attempt at identification, or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength. It is not free, however, to open the premise to question because the premise is its foundation. The ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own. The ego's ceaseless attempts to gain the spirit's acknowledgement and thus establish its own existence are useless. Spirit in its knowledge is unaware of the ego. It does not attack it. It merely cannot conceive of it at all. While the ego is equally unaware of spirit, it does perceive itself as being rejected by something greater than itself. This is why self-esteem in ego terms must be delusional. The creations of God do not create myths, although creative effort can be turned to mythology. It can do so, however, only under one condition: what it makes is then no longer creative. Myths are entirely perceptual and so ambiguous in form and characteristically good and evil in nature that the most benevolent of them is not without fearful connotations. Myths and magic are closely associated, since myths are usually related to ego origins, and magic to the powers the ego ascribes to itself. Mythological systems generally include some account of, quote, the creation, unquote, and associate this with its particular form of magic. The so-called, quote, battle for survival, unquote, is only the ego's struggle to preserve itself and its interpretation of its own beginning. This beginning is usually associated with physical birth because it is hard to maintain that the ego existed before that point in time. The more, quote, religiously, quote, unquote, ego-oriented may believe that the soul existed before and will continue to exist after a temporary lapse into ego life. Some even believe that the soul will be punished for this lapse. However, salvation does not apply to spirit, which is not in danger and does not need to be salvaged. Salvation is nothing more than, quote, right-mindedness, unquote, which is not the one-mindedness of the Holy Spirit, but which must be achieved before one-mindedness is restored. Right-mindedness leads to the next step automatically because right perception is uniformly without attack, and therefore wrong-mindedness is obliterated. The ego cannot survive without judgment and is laid aside accordingly. The mind then has only one direction in which it can move. Its direction is always automatic because it cannot but be dictated by the thought system to which it adheres. It cannot be emphasized too often that correcting perception is merely a temporary expedient. It is necessary only because misperception is a block to knowledge, while accurate perception is a stepping stone towards it. The whole value of right perception lies in the inevitable realization that all perception is unnecessary. This removes the block entirely. You may ask how this is possible as long as you appear to be living in this world. That is a reasonable question. You must be careful, however, that you really understand it. Who is the you, quote unquote, you, who are living in this world? Spirit is immortal, and immortality is a constant state. It is as true now as it ever was or ever will be, because it implies no change at all. It is not a continuum, nor is it understood by being compared to an opposite. Knowledge never involves comparisons. That is its main difference from everything else the mind can grasp. Okay. Again, so much said, so little time. Took 10 minutes approximately to read that. And maybe we'll spend 5 or 10 minutes talking about it. One of the, I think, again, maybe one of the points that will make this a little bit clearer is when Jesus says, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong page. Here we go. The ego cannot survive without judgment and is laid aside accordingly. And he's talking about that in regard to, the question of, is it possible to live without ego, essentially? And as we slowly lay aside our judgment, we return first to right-mindedness, what Jesus calls right-mindedness, as opposed to wrong-mindedness. Wrong-mindedness is where we side with the ego, and we basically identify with the ego, whereas right-mindedness is for Jesus is identifying with the atonement principle, which essentially is the idea that that we are all still at home in God, and God is wholly loving, and because God is wholly loving, so are we, which means that there is no guilt, there's no fear, there's no judgment. Now, because we are still that even now, Jesus is saying we can, and he said this before, we can live without judgment. And as we do that, what happens is we open the way to returning back to let's say God awareness of God, true knowledge, as opposed to perception. Right, even right-mindedness, Jesus is saying, we're still in the world of perception. And in the world of perception, we are an ego among other egos. It's our ego that asks the question, how the mind could ever make the ego. And Jesus says, that's the best question you could ask, but the ego doesn't really want the answer, and you don't even have to refer to the past, because you can see it happening right now in the present. And if you can't see it, it's because of the identification with the ego. That's why, again, there's a point at which faith and trust come in to this, and you'd have to really trust the source of this material, and if you don't, then it doesn't make you bad or wrong or anything. It just might mean that this is not for you. But Jesus is saying, while you're here, why not give it a try? He's not ordering you or demanding anyone to do anything. He's not a cult leader saying, give me all your money, worldly possessions, don't talk to your family. Don't talk about the cult to anyone, etc., etc. And he's not saying this is the only truth. This is the only true path to God. And I've been in groups like that have said that we're the only true path, essentially. No, he's just presenting this and saying, why not give it a try? I mean, originally it was for Helen and Bill, directed towards Helen and Bill. Even for Helen, who was very reluctant, he was saying, why not give it a try? That's what Bill told Helen initially when she started getting the message of this is A Course in Miracles. Bill said, well, why not write it down and see if it makes sense and see if it's something that's worth writing down. The same with practicing the Course. Why not, you're here, why not give it a little bit more attention, focus, and maybe you'll see what Jesus is saying. And I think, from my perspective and from others I know that have done the Course, it makes all the difference, really, because it's not even only A Course in Miracles that you hear about, the problem of judgment and how judgment, which is really the other side of forgiveness, judgment does not make for a happy person or a happy camper in this world. The more that we sit in judgment of ourselves and others, it just is the recipe for dis-ease on so many levels. Jesus is just presenting this, idea in a way, in a very, beautifully expressed, and also very, I don't want to say analytical, but he's laying it out piece by piece for us, and he's trying to, it's a brilliant argument that he's making, I think the bottom line is you don't need judgment. That quote from one of the earlier sections, you don't need judgment to organize your life, which is another way of saying you don't need the ego to organize your life. There's still that part of you that is still one with God, and that is here right now in this moment. And because that is here right now, your God self is here right now. And all you need to do is learn how to tune into that. And Jesus is trying to help you to do that. And like he said in the previous section, once he helps you do that, you no longer need to hold his hand. You can do it on your own. He doesn't want you to, you don't have to be an eternal student of A Course in Miracles or an eternal disciple sitting at his feet forever. He wants you to become like him. And Jesus himself is, for the Course, speaking, because I've been listening to a lot of these, like the Myth Vision podcast, and Bart Ehrman and Richard Carrier and all these guys that are talking about the historical Jesus. But for the Course, it doesn't really matter if Jesus existed or not. Maybe he did. Maybe there was a historical Jesus. Okay, great. It's really more Jesus as a symbol, because whether it's Jesus or whether it's any other figure that symbolizes perfect love or unconditional love or the pure love of God, it doesn't matter who it is. As long as that person symbolizes that for you, you can use that to help you. Like instead of what would Jesus do, you could say, I don't know, how would Jesus love in this situation, or what would the love of Jesus or the love of God do in this situation or think in this situation. And Jesus is is saying again and again, seeing your brother, seeing the other in the highest light, seeing them as they really are, as they truly are, beyond time and space, which is just like you, exactly like you. And the love of God, which you are, is what they are. Any judgment that you would make keeps both of you in prison. Any judgment that is other than that keeps both of you in prison. Do you really want that? No, you don't want that. Why not change your mind now? And let's leave it right there. I like what I said right there. So let's leave on a good note. And thank you so much for tuning in. I'd love to hear your comments. And this is the Truly Helpful channel. My name is Alawa, and I'm going to keep doing this till we get through the whole course, and then there'll be, we're going to keep the learning going and so on. Thank you.